So Gabby, you have a passion for design, all right? Was that nature or nurture, right? Or did you just innately were you born with that desire for design and passion for it, or did it develop a little bit over time, or maybe both?
I would say both, but largely nature. Ever since I was a young child, I was very creative. I was very imaginative. My brother was much more logical, very analytical. So there's a very clear difference between the two of us. So I think that something, creative and in design, or even earlier, it was more straightforward in the form of like writing and art, were things that I really enjoyed. And then kind of finding out that design is this profession where you can do those elements of those things in a more practiced way. But I would say largely nature. I've always been that way. But my parents were very encouraging. I got to do a lot of different creative programs, photography programs growing up, art classes, things to help curate and nurture what they saw in me naturally as kind of a creative, imaginative young child.
So when you're in the design creative, that's kind of it's the artist's world, right? And so did you ever feel a little different in the way that you viewed the world, in the way that you perceived the world, the way you operated in the world growing up? Was there like I'm obviously in school and friends, but I'm also a little
Sure.
different. Was that ever something that came up for you?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest differences for me was always existing like very much in between an analytical scientific lens. I was, in all of those kind of AP classes. I felt a lot of success doing math and science, but then I would be in the AP art class and I'd be doing painting. And there weren't very many people that were in both of those parts of my lives. There were like my friends from kind of these activities and then other peers and friends from the other activities. So I think that for me, like even now in my daily work, it's that cross-disciplinary intersection of things, which is why I studied architecture, because I did love math and science, but I also love the idea of making and physical making and creativity. And so I really like things that sit at the intersection, right? So when you think about a true artist, an artist is not a designer because they don't have to make for anyone but themselves, right? And that's a beautiful thing. Like their art is their artistic expression. When you're a designer, you're solving a problem. You're doing something for someone else or for someone else, plural. You're given a lot of constraints and challenges, right? So I learned that, in architecture school, you have all these constraints of the site, of the budget, of material, of physics, and then you create within the confinement of that, which breeds a lot of creativity. When you're a true artist, you kind of really do work from the blank canvas and you can make anything. And that's what makes art special as well. So in the creative community, there is a pretty big distinction between being an artist and being a designer. So I think for me, being a designer is really apt because I have that creative side. I have that, I want to make physical things. I want to see something tangible come alive that isn't, an Excel sheet or something, on the screen, but I also really work well within constraints and real world rigor. And that's what you get with architecture, product design, interface design. There's a lot of technical requirements and restraints that you have to be creative within.
And but you're still birthing something, right? And so you still get to bring something to
100%.
life, right? And
Absolutely.
so no, I love. Thank you for drawing that distinction. I think that's super
Yeah.
powerful, and you've obviously had success as a designer academically,
Mhm.
corporately. But we're going to move a little bit into your courageous decision because all of a sudden you're a Fortune 100 company, and you are given the opportunity to step up and become a chief of staff to a very senior leader, right?
Right.
And so tell me a little bit about the genesis of how that happened and maybe some of the feelings that came along with that in the sense of,
Yeah.
excitement, butterflies in your stomach, reservations. That's the start of that little genesis right there.
Totally. I think one of the things that a lot of people can resonate with when they move from one role to the next is, it's been said many times, but the thing that got you to a position of moving to that next place is not going to be the thing that you need to do in that next place. And someone can say that to you, you can read it in a book, but until you really experience it, it feels almost kind of like a whiplash because the reason that you got, as much eminence or the opportunity to do something like a chief of staff is not necessarily what you're going to need to do at all as a chief of staff. And especially for me coming from product design, right? I mean, I'm working with engineering, product managers, and other designers to create real products, things that people use, interfaces, physical hardware, product design. And I had a lot of success with that. And I was able to present my work to very, very, very senior executives within this company. And so I had developed sort of a trust and a reputation as someone who could deliver great product and get things done. And that kind of put me in a group of visibility for opportunities like this chief of staff position. But I actually didn't know anything about it. I didn't have peers that were chiefs of staff. You know, even the best designers and some of the product managers that I knew, none of them had been chiefs of staff. I think at this particular company, it was typically relegated for someone who was an S&O, right? Maybe a business analyst. They weren't really part of my world. And so when I became this chief of staff, it was a complete 180, again, like the things that I did to get me there versus what I would have to do in the role. And I think taking that leap of faith at first kind of blindly, and then when I realized what I'd gotten myself into, I was going to have to do an entirely different job, right? And how can I bring my soft skills, how can I bring those skills that transcend disciplines, again, kind of that cross-discipline intersection, into this role while developing an entirely new set of hard skills that I never had, ever even been exposed to previously in my former role. So it was a huge adjustment and a lot to definitely learn, but you find your way through. So I'm sure many people have experienced that kind of like, you're in a completely different job role now.
No, so I love that. So you got on the radar screen because you could execute effectively and efficiently and get things done. So people are picking up on, wow, this is real leadership material. Did you see the role coming? I mean, did you see the chief of staff, or did it come out of nowhere in the sense, hey, you got a call on a Tuesday afternoon?
It was really quick. So I had been told, it's funny, I had been told several times I would go and present to these very senior executives at corporate, or they would come visit, and people would say to me, you're going to be an EA. And I was like, I don't know what that is. And they're like, you're going to be an executive assistant. And at the time I thought, I was like, is that a compliment or not? I'm a product. You're telling me I'm going to be a good, I mean, a scheduler is an incredibly important role, but I didn't understand what they were saying. I'm like, I'm a product designer and you're telling me. And so EA is a shorthand for usually a younger or more junior chief of staff, at least at the company where I worked. And so that's what people were just saying to me after I presented, or they'd spent time with me in a workshop. And so I was like, okay, well, someone, says you're quack like a duck and whatever, you're a duck. So I was like, maybe I should try this. Maybe I should actually seek it out, because that was my first exposure to even the role existing, was people telling me that. So I went to one of the senior executives who was one of my mentors, and I told him this was something I was interested in. And he was like, absolutely, let's figure this out. There's a very small network at the top. And it was a super fast process once I got matched with the executive that I ended up working for. We're talking like maybe 10 days between the initial kind of like, all right, to the, having an interview with his current chief of staff, to having an interview with him, to getting the call that afternoon, to moving teams in 3 days. I mean, it's incredibly fast, because these senior executives, when they need a chief of staff, they need one badly, because their previous chief of staff is rotating out. And when you're not in that world, you don't understand, like, why does it have to be this fast? Shouldn't I wrap up my files for my team? But that senior executive, they want you, they need you for their next big, management meeting, because their chief of staff's leaving. So it's a very, very fast process once that ball got rolling. And again, I was just exposed to it almost felt like working at a different company, because in product design, we had just been working in such a different way than these senior executives did. But of course, I still worked with a lot of VPs of product, but not so much with the team level.
I mean, in retrospect, do you think that 10 days was a blessing in disguise? Like, you kind of didn't quite know, you didn't quite know what you were getting yourself into. You didn't have time to overthink it. You know what I mean?
I think so. Yeah. It definitely added to the whirlwind experience. And it is an experience. I mean, whether you want to be a chief of staff, whether you want to take a risk and take that job in Germany, or do so. I mean, sometimes you just want it to happen in this whirlwind way, because that's the experience that you'll reflect on. Probably good. I didn't get to do too many Google searches. I didn't get to meet with too many chiefs of staff and pick their brains. Like, sometimes you just got to go for something all in, a little bit blind, and kind of, learn as you go. So in some ways, I think it was a blessing. I don't think it would have made too much of a difference. I don't think I would have been able to learn enough in a month or 2 months anyways, before getting into the role. So, but yeah, it definitely kind of added to this kind of crazy ride from beginning to end. So
you got this ride, you got this whirlwind. And I think you were chief of staff to an SVP or GM. I mean, somebody very high up in the organization, correct? Okay. So you're representing that person, you're advocating for that person, you're managing for that person. I mean, it's a very powerful role, right? And so, but like you alluded to, you said directly, there were a lot of parts of that role you had never had any exposure to. Was there any form of, I mean, such a cliche term, like imposter syndrome, or you felt like, man, some days you felt like a hero, some days you're like, I'm just drinking from a fire hose. How did you manage all those range of emotions and ups and downs?
Oh, totally. I mean, it really is that way where I think too, though, unless you are already a relatively senior individual or have already had quite a large remit of responsibility before you are a chief of staff. So let's say you're already a program director or even a director, right, before you become a chief of staff for, say, like the CMO or something like that. But barring that, I mean, I don't think it's possible for a chief of staff to be good at absolutely everything, right? Because you're being asked to dip in and out of like 10 different roles throughout the day where people that you're interacting with are just doing those things. You have the sales leader, the product leader, and you're trying to help with all of those functions. So, I think what ends up happening is if you look at all the things a chief of staff has to do and you kind of give yourself a rating card or a scorecard, you're really strong in these areas, and then these areas you're just barely surviving, and then these areas you're getting better, right? I mean, everybody's matrix is just a little bit different. And so there were some days and some tasks where I felt like an absolute boss. I felt super in charge. I was very good at getting people to deliver. I was very organized in my brain. I knew exactly every meeting, every topic, every context, every person that my executive was going to meet with. I was very good at that side of things. I struggled a lot with like corporate finance deliverables and going in all these really kind of gorpy finance dashboards that even the finance team struggled with because I had never even pulled financial data as a product designer. I just think that wasn't even part of it, let alone at these massive Fortune 100 companies. This isn't easy to, properly, get all these numbers. Like the way that different business units are collecting data is incredibly disparate sometimes. So it's an incredibly difficult financial task, accounting task that I did not have the skills for. But what I was good at was finding the right people to help me, making the best use of their time, and then helping them in ways that I could because of the position that I was in. So you hack it one way or another, right? You figure out how to build your network, you figure out how to do those different skills. But I'll say too, just like on one of the interesting parts of the job that I didn't expect to have as much of, I wouldn't say an issue with, but definitely an adjustment. So much of what had gotten me to the visibility point of being a chief of staff was my ability to go into a room, storytell, captivate the audience, and kind of do a little bit of like a show. I was very good at getting executives excited. I was kind of the, opening act for whatever, quarterly meeting they were going to have or whatnot, right? When you become a chief of staff, you are very much behind. You are to be, it's your executive who's the star of the show, as they should be, and you are there to support them. And I think I struggled with that. Not, I mean, my executive was wonderful. We're still great friends, but just personally, I got a lot of joy in my work out of getting on the stage at the conference, going and giving the talk,
the feedback,
the feedback, but also just the adrenaline rush, the storytelling. It's an extension of the product design for me. And when you're working for these executives, my job was, make sure the audio equipment's at his house, make sure his speaker notes are cleaned up, make sure he has everything he needs to have that feeling. And so you do feel like, as it should be by design, but your life is really in service to somebody else, your professional life. And I did develop like this deep responsibility for this individual. I was very protective of my executive. I really wanted to, help him. I wanted to remove any blockers. I wanted to give him my point of view on the dynamics from a conversation versus his, and we would discuss them. I wanted him to feel set up for success and comfortable and excited and like he had everything he needed at all times. And it's just a very big shift. It's almost like a weird way of saying this, like becoming a parent or something. It completely shifts. Like it's not about my success, is that this person felt like they had all the facts and figures they needed on this major business call. And it's no longer about how you're kind of focusing on yourself, if that makes sense. And that's it's a good point of view to have. It's just something you don't really, it was very different for me. And I think a lot of people who are really fast paced, really killing it, MBAs, people who want to be chiefs of staff, they will experience this as well. It's a little bit humbling, because you kind of go from being the star of your little universe to, oh my gosh, I just want to, everything I do is in service of this person so that they can really run a business as effectively as possible. And you feel a deep
Yeah.
responsibility for that.
It's like servant leadership, and I love that you touched on humility,
100%.
because I think there is some humility in that, right? There is some humility in being like, wait a
100%.
minute, I'm waking up every single day trying to figure how how do you protect, and I'm not sure there is a fine line, a hard boundary on this, not developing a professional, obviously, codependent relationship in the sense that you feel their mood swings, you feel their highs, you feel
Oh,
their
sure.
lows, you feel their stress. I bet you could sense it. Not everything is verbal, right? Is that true? Am I onto something there?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, the way we would have a phone call, visual cues in a meeting, and you don't just learn to sense that from your own executive by any means. You learn to sense it from your executive's boss. You learn to sense it from your executive's reports. You learn to sense it from everyone in the room. The chiefs of staff will often work together as a community to flag, a stressor over here. Okay, that might be why this is being felt over here, and we're doing it in a way to try to benefit all the key players involved. But absolutely, we're picking up on verbal cues, visual cues, and in this world, when I was a chief of staff, it was all remote during COVID. But yeah, I can tell from a phone call, intonation in a phone call. I can tell from a 4-line email versus, I mean, you can definitely tell these mood swings. You can tell the undertones. At this high of an executive level, these professionals are immensely professional, to be clear. I mean, they're very professional. So it's, there's a nuance to picking up when someone might be a little bit passive aggressive, or when they say something and by that they mean I want this Monday, or when they say something and by that they mean you messed up, right? You have to really know how to read the room and figure out all of those complex dynamics. There's so many different interrelationships going on. And that was also something that I was very strong at. I was very good at reading the room, being able to assess people's intonation and voice, and that probably came from my experience research background. And so you just try to lean into those areas and be empathetic and try to think, okay, what do I need to figure out is going on in sales that might be impacting why this deliverable isn't ready yet. And sometimes your job is also, when do you absolutely keep that away from your executives
Mm-hmm.
awareness, and
Mm-hmm.
when do you escalate it, right?
Because
It's
you're protecting the
all
headspace, right? Yeah.
100%. You're protecting their headspace, so you don't want to let certain things hit their desk, but at the same time there are certain things that absolutely should hit their desk, right? And when those things do, they should have the space to address them, and they should be of importance enough that they recognize, hey, I'm bringing this to you for a reason. It's definitely an art, not a science. And part of that is having to learn your executive in a super fast amount of time, because you're only going to work with this person from anywhere to 6 to 18 months. So you have to learn them inside and out very quickly so that you can properly escalate, de-escalate, and respond to them very quickly. And they're in their job and they're blown and going. I mean, my executive was obviously very respectful of me and helped onboard me, but there's only so much an executive can do. They're expecting you to really be ready to go, right?
Well, I
Because
mean,
they're
yeah,
busy. Yeah,
it is a stretch exercise, right, to a certain extent.
for
And
sure.
and did it feel like an internship in senior leadership on some level? I mean, did it feel like, okay, this is the inner workings of, the top one or two layers of corporate Fortune 100?
Oh, totally. I mean, it was definitely that fly on the wall syndrome for sure. Just learning like the language and the nature of some of these conversations. I would never have been exposed to anything like this anytime soon in my career. But I think part of my design lens was learning how much these people are also just people. They get stressed out, they get burnt out, they have families, they don't want to be sitting in their desk all the time with COVID either. So I think it does demystify too some of the nerves I think people have about presenting to senior executives or wanting to reach out to that mentor. You've always think these are just people, they're just people, they're doing a job, they're incredibly smart people, they're incredibly dedicated people. And so that's not to take away from their accomplishments, but they're also people. And we were all like on these calls getting served lunches from our loved ones because we had so many meetings and COVID had just started and nobody could leave the house. And I would always make an effort to ask these executives how they were doing. So many of them have traveled every week of their life since they were 29 years old. They've never been at home this long. So trying to find those little moments of just humanity, I think, is really important. And I think, if anybody's ever been so scared or worried or nervous around these senior executives, they're really just people as well. So I think having those bits of humanity. But yes, I mean, even some meetings I wasn't privy to, right? If they were with the CEO or certain levels of leadership. And you really do see how it operates right up to the very, very top. And chiefs of staff kind of work in that same way, right? So you have the chief of staff to the CEO, and then you have the chiefs of staff to the C-suite, and then you have chiefs of staff to the SVPs. My layer was GM below that, and then you have VPs below that. So that also often dictates how we work together and what meetings we sit in on. And so there's a whole little hierarchy within us, within this very, very top of the
No, exactly.
well.
I mean, if I think in military terms, it sounds like you were serving a 2-star general.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Great analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, powerful general, 2-star general. You had a double whammy in to a certain extent, because I'm going to make an assumption here, and you correct me if I'm wrong. You're coming from product design world, which it's intense, no question about it, but it's a little bit more structured, maybe time-wise. Like you knew when you could turn off for the day, and you were back on tomorrow or back on Monday.
Right.
Then you hit COVID, which means there are no boundaries because everything is blended, right? So was there any culture shock and like, good Lord, man, my Slack is going off at 10:30 at night, right? How did that impact you, your rest, your relationships? Like, can we, totally. the maybe the boundarylessness? I don't know if I'm using the right words here, but are you?
Yeah, you're spot on. I think one of the luxuries of design and tech and product design, it is intense and people are very passionate. So I think that just automatically creates this like, you want to make a really great product kind of thing. But we do have a lot of autonomy over our time. Something I knew in text and didn't really know until I didn't have it anymore. I really appreciate that now. Because we do have a lot of control over our calendars about, when we feel we should work, when we're going to be ready for a review, and people give us that space because then we do our best work. So it's a very big benefit of the culture of being a designer in tech. Not to say, obviously, we don't have tough deadlines, but it's nothing like some of these other roles. So when I took this role, again, COVID did make it extra challenging. We didn't get to do a lot of travel, but I actually got married 2 weeks after taking this role. And it was rather spontaneous. My husband and I are very happy together, almost 2 years married now, but it was rather spontaneous. And I had been, out of school, single. I wouldn't say I was a workaholic in the way that maybe a New Yorker in finance would say that term, right? But I would say I was kind of a workaholic. I loved work. I loved traveling for work. Work was where I got a lot of my social life, a lot of my personal worth, just a lot of enjoyment. I loved it. And then I met my husband and we very quickly got married. And that timed with this crazy work opportunity, right? And that probably wasn't, maybe meant to be in terms of the timing of those two wonderful things being at the same time. He was very supportive. And it was wonderful to have him as a support system through all of it. He would listen to me on my really good days and my funny stories and the cool things I got to do. And he would listen to me on the tough days when I was feeling pretty low. But the time, was very challenging to be a newlywed and have to work like this. I mean, that these folks are working for sure, 16, 18-hour days often. I think, though, that anything you care about, you have to prioritize. Many of the senior executives would all ride their Peloton in the morning, or they would all work out in the morning. I started doing the same thing of always trying to work out in the morning, even if it killed me, because it was something for me. But yeah, it was incredibly difficult. I was not used to getting, pings late at night, pings early in the morning. We had meetings start at 6 a.m., and even more so than the duration of the work, right? Was just the meeting after meeting after meeting. Because what happens is I'll try to run interference for my executives so that they can have the heads down time that they need, or some breathing time before a very important client call. But then I have to go attend that other meeting that they're missing to take notes for them, right? So my day is just no lunch break, no breaks at all. I mean, it's just back to back every single day. And as someone who was coming from a really creative world, one of the things that we need in our product design discipline is free time, because that's when we sketch. Like, I'm so used to, like, I'll have my crazy days and then I'll have my, DNS, don't schedule me days, because I'm ideating, I'm thinking. I don't need to talk to a bunch of people to get my work done. And
Yeah.
these roles are not like that. We got to be meeting, we got to be sharing notes, we got to be pulling data, we got to be sharing that data. It's like there's no time. I will say though that I do think that part of the business that I got to be exposed to is missing some of that. I mean, people do need to sit and stare at the wall. It's when some of those utopia ideas come to you. It's when some of those great
Yeah.
nuggets come to you, and they often are not
Yeah.
carving out enough time for themselves, because everyone wants a meeting and everyone wants this thing reviewed and everybody wants their feedback and everybody wants them on a client call. And you're actually taking some of the brightest, sharpest, most creative minds in the company and you're kind of bludgeoning them with meetings all the time. So I do think that that part of the corporate structure could take some notes from how some of the more creative disciplines view how time is actually valuably spent. And sometimes that's spent alone listening to some music and really thinking about your product portfolio instead of having to get on that call. Like delegate it, tell somebody else to do it. Don't go. I mean, what are
Yeah.
you, really trying to do in those senior roles to be a leader? So, but yeah, the time was, 16-hour days going from a very comfortable 8-hour work week previously with a nice long lunch break.
Well,
So
no,
big difference.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Big
yeah, that
difference.
lunch
Yeah.
break never felt so good. But
Yeah.
I've got so many questions around this because this is super interesting to me. Number one is, I agree with you. If you don't get the time to recharge, you're just not showing up with your A+ thinking. You're
100%.
so good that you'll get good stuff out there, but a lot of the great stuff might be missed, right? Just because there's just
Right.
no time to let it ideate and rest. Um, Interesting place to be though, because how can I put this to make sense? Track along with me here. So correct me if I'm wrong. It's interesting. Was guilt a part of the equation where
Hmm.
you were balancing guilt, like I should be giving more to my leader, or my husband needs more time, and then in all of that, where was time for you, right? Because you're
Hmm.
juggling other people, and then is this making sense? Is
Yeah.
this am I picking up on something that you might have been experiencing?
Yeah. I mean, guilt, I'm not sure as much about guilt as much as like I felt like I had made all of these big promises to people, right? Obviously, the promise of marriage and the promise of being a chief of staff. And so you just feel this great responsibility. And you
Responsibility. Yeah.
feel, yeah, and you just feel this. I mean, I had this like intrinsic caring. Like I couldn't go to bed if I knew there was some open item that if I fixed it, it would help the next day for my executive. Like I wanted
Yeah.
to show up and I wanted to be there. And then obviously being a newlywed, like you want to enjoy those first few months together and you want to, go out and do fun things. Obviously COVID made it a little challenging. But yeah, I think this just this great deal of responsibility. And for that period of time, most of my life, um, I've been able to be very selfish, right? And not in a detrimental way to anyone else, but it's been, me studying in school, me focusing on this project, me applying to this job, me wanting, this certain presentation opportunity. It's all about me. And it's just interesting how with this chief of staff role, even though in some ways people might view this as like a feather in your cap or something competitive that people go after, something sought after, when you're in the role itself, it's really selfless. I mean, it's really pretty selfless because you want to make sure this executive and their surrounding team and everyone that you work with has a positive experience of that
Yeah.
executive, has a positive takeaway. You want your executive to trust you. I mean, there's a lot about like inner circle and making sure things are delicately handled. And so it's just a great deal of responsibility. And so I would say in the time that I was a chief of staff, my life was really not about me very much at all.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's the why by design the chief of staff roles are rotational in nature, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they're not intended to be a long-term role. And I think that it's a very humbling, experience. I was incredibly humbled too by just watching my executive context switch. I mean, we're talking, marketing strategy meeting to an engineering highly technical meeting to a client, pitch to a keynote talk to a financial discussion about the quarter's results. I mean, the context switching is insane to be able to drop into these calls every 30 minutes and almost have this entirely different level of expertise. So there's just a lot of humility and learning. But it was very much a part of my life where it did not feel, focused around myself because you're serving this much larger kind of entity.
But you're running in that role, I'm assuming, or is it, you're running on adrenaline a lot, right? So you're running at a very high level of energy, adrenaline. Is that correct? Like there's a lot of adrenaline.
Well, I would say that's more correct traditionally if I hadn't done this role in COVID. That's another whole piece of this. Like
Yeah,
when
yeah.
we got into this community of other chiefs of staff, so the kind of class before us, if you will, the chiefs of staff who had served our executives in our business unit before we did, they were the last kind of group before COVID. And they were traveling to Japan, Dubai, there's just so much like you're moving so fast, and I think there's so much adrenaline. And for me, my personality type, I think that's what I had initially envisioned going out, into this role, because I'm a kind of work hard, play hard, like you really get to see the world and do these crazy things, and then you're up all night, and it's just this like, almost just crazy experience. I think in COVID, it was incredibly hard for all of us, executives included. And this was again at the beginning of COVID. I became a chief of staff in April 2020. So everyone was adjusting. No one knew how long it was going to be. And again, going back to that idea that executives are just humans, okay?
Yeah.
Usually these demands also involve getting to go to fun dinners, getting to see colleagues, counterparts, clients that you've known for 20 years, getting to take your family on a trip
Correct.
after you finish
Yeah.
your work. Yeah, I mean, there's an experience of life in the middle of all this crazy workload that you have. And these are the adrenaline seekers who seek out roles like this, right? Because people who are more content to be a little bit more relaxed maybe don't want to have a role like this. And then you have all of us young adrenaline seekers, us work hard, play hard, wanting to get into that world. And then these people fully in that world, and we're all at home and we're all still
Yeah.
having to do the same level of business. And I mean, some of the executives especially were really struggling because they were so used to being on the go, and you feel like life, you feel alive when you're
Yeah.
moving like
Yeah.
that. And when you're just sitting and doing the exact same work without the human interaction, without the conferences, without the keynotes, without any of that, I think that a lot of the adrenaline was lost, which makes this work very hard because you don't have the work hard, play hard. It's the work hard, work hard, work hard, go to bed, order dinner because you can't even go to a restaurant. I mean, it's really, really challenging. I
Yeah.
think for a lot of people, a lot of my friends that were in product management or product design, just people in general, I think for some of them, COVID was almost a time to relax and be a little bit introspective at first because they were able to carve out more free time in their space. Nothing was as much of a rush. But depending on where you were, what your particular job role is or where you were in your company at the time, yeah, that was an incredibly hard part of it, was to keep beating at that same insane pace
Yeah.
without any of the adrenaline of the hustle and bustle and flying around doing consulting. I mean, there's an energy that comes with that, and
Absolutely.
all that was gone for everyone, all the way up to the CEO. I mean, all of us were experiencing the same thing together, which was kind of interesting when you think about it. Again, just showing that everyone's a human and everyone was having a rough time with that for sure.
One of the things you touched on is the transition from being part of the adrenaline, giving the presentation, telling the story, being a big part of that, the
Right.
front end of the house, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
and then serving your executive more privately or quietly, less
Right.
limelight, for lack of a better term. But one of the things that a lot of people want to reach your executive, but they have to go through
Right.
you first, right? So was there some surprise in, wow, I've got some senior leaders who are now engaging with me, treating me almost like a peer in some ways, to gain access or to collaborate or to get some time on the calendar? Are you seeing where I'm going with this? Like, so
Oh, totally.
you didn't get the
Yeah.
limelight on the front of the house, but you got a different sort of maybe attention or connection with senior leaders.
Yeah, it was interesting. I had a vice president of product management who had been my VP of product management on the products that I used to make. And I became a chief of staff, and then he moved over under my boss. So now we were both reporting to the same person, which was kind of funny. And we became more like friends. He used to be my VP, and now he's my kind of peer. Not really, but we're reporting to the same boss. There's a lot of that. I think one of the biggest things that surprised me was like this other part of my personality that had never maybe had a reason or a context to come forth, right? So I had never been a gatekeeper before. I was always like, can I go there? Can I try to get this person to talk to me? Like, I'm the person that the gatekeeper is like, no, like stay out. So
Right,
I
you're
wasn't
banging
that.
down doors and working,
Yeah, I was
coming
like,
through the
hey,
window, whatever. Yeah, yeah.
exactly, coming down from the roof. And now I'm this gatekeeper. And I kind of developed a reputation for being like, it was positively received, but kind of being like a little bit of a bulldog. Like, no, like you know, I need to know exactly why. And it was well received, and my executive really appreciated it. And I did it in as respectful a way as possible. But I really developed this part of my personality that I didn't even really, had ever expressed, where I was a very stringent and good gatekeeper. I was pretty, adamant about why this person needed to meet with my executive. I felt that I was very in tune with my executive in terms of their needs, their emotional needs. If they had some big business client engagement coming up that was taking up all of their headspace, they probably wouldn't even be that beneficial of a review. This can wait until next week. But on the alternate side, you have to remember that you're not going to be working for this executive forever directly, right? And that these VPs that are going to eventually be your boss's boss again, right? Yes. So it's a very delicate balance to form relationships, but to always have the priority being the current executive you're serving without in any way endangering those relationships that could potentially be your leaders, right? You just always want to have a culture of respect. But yeah, I was definitely a pretty stringent gatekeeper. I also, I would try to run interference when I could sense if my executive was not going to be happy about something or was expecting something different. I would try to get ahead of that and, give a pretty stern phone call to a VP so that they could give enough, get the heads up and the message they needed so we could avoid, an escalation coming at a later date. So yeah. There's interference in two ways, right? I mean, there's interference of, you're kind of protecting your executive's time, both from external and internal sources, to make sure it's really valuable use of their time. But there's also trying to disseminate messages to reports and peers of your executive before it comes to a head with the executive, right? You kind of get ahead of it and you're giving out signals and you're reaching out to VPs and telling them in advance, I'm warning you, if you don't have these numbers or you don't have a messaging around this in this presentation, that's all he's going to comment about. So let's get that in there so that you can actually have him, there's the two different kinds. So it's not always just people trying to get access, but it's also you reaching out to them and kind of giving them a little bit of a, hey, like you need to do this way, or we need to figure out another way before this certain date of this deliverable.
But what I'm hearing is you actually being of service to them as well, right? I mean, you were doing it so positive, as positive a meeting as possible, both parties, right? So no, I get that. I mean, were there some meetings you were in where you just had to pinch yourself and be like, I can't believe I'm sitting in this meeting right now, listening to what I'm listening to. Like it was just such a high level of power and influence that you're like, wow, this is heady stuff.
Yeah, and sometimes that feeling, comes with some of the more challenging discussions, things about resourcing, headcount, those are hard discussions to sit in if you've never been in one before, especially coming from, product design lens. You just never have that purview of like, how many sellers the business unit's going to be able to support or not support that year. And you really realize what they're actually saying, right? I mean, these are serious discussions about people's livelihood, and then sometimes great discussions about how they're growing a certain part of the business and they have all these open headcounts, right? So, but it's just when you're talking about people on that macro level, it's not something I was used to. I was very fortunate. Again, I think one of the reasons, pretty much the reason I got this chief of staff role definitely wasn't my S&O acumen by any means. It was some of those executive opportunities. And I had, presented to the board of directors. I had presented in a meeting at corporate that many VPs never ever got to present in. It was an unusual situation. It was just kind of like almost a fluke. And so I wasn't quite as maybe starry-eyed in that sense, but it was more like hearing those macro level discussions and just seeing the interconnectedness of the business that I didn't even understand as a product designer on one specific portfolio within one business unit. I'm like, oh my gosh, like all of these things, and there's all these people that represent the heads of just these huge businesses, and the synergy. And being in those meetings, it was like, this huge company is so small right now, and that's a crazy feeling because all of those business units are represented right now. They're all in the room together trying to talk about next year. And that scale is really pretty crazy. There were some meetings, for example, that even my executive was not privy to, right? So that would have just been SVPs, and then there's just the C-suite. So you do kind of get this, what happened in that meeting, or, you try to get a little bit of a gut check from the chiefs of staff, the tier above you, like, how did it go? Because everybody's like, that meeting's not on my calendar, so you kind of whatever. But it is pretty interesting, and then you have to sometimes remember, like, there were certain client calls that I was on, and that was really cool too, to be on a call with like the C-suite of a really huge tech startup that we all use or something like that. I mean, I would often pinch myself after those meetings, especially since as a product designer, I loved some of their products. So I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm on a call with like this person at this really cool, company that has this great product. And I would want to tell my design friends about something like that, So those were kind of the pinch me moments, were just seeing every business unit represented in a room, and just realizing how small this company had just gotten, and how cool it was to have that synergy. And then also with some of these external clients of some of the best products in the world, I was like, wow, this is crazy that I'm on a call with these people. So.
And then you transitioned off, right? It was kind of like a preset. You transitioned off. What do you miss about the role? What do you not miss about the role? And what have you taken from the role that you now currently use in your existing capacities?
Yeah, I missed a lot about the role. It's funny because once you get some distance, I think in any life experience, you tend to hopefully reflect on the positives. So when I remember the role, I remember it very positively, although I know there were some things that were very hard for me personally, the time, the commitment, the overabundance of hard skills that I didn't have in that domain. But the people I'm still incredibly good friends with, my executive, I'm still incredibly good friends with many of the people that I worked with. There was a head writer that I became really close with. Now she's one of my best friends, and we all met up literally like a week or two ago. So I definitely miss the people. There's a deep, deep camaraderie that forms in these highly intense professional relationships, right? I mean, like, the friendship just kind of, hopefully, for most folks, endures. And you just remember those days when everything was like running, everything was blowing and going, everything was super organized. A certain keynote killed it. A bunch of people worked on it together. I mean, there were just a lot of like those moments where it took so many people and so many moving parts. And when you felt that kind of momentum of things going well, it felt really good, because this is big business and you're helping make these things happen. And that feeling of being so critical and learning so much at the same time, and just that deep, deep camaraderie with people, even if you disagree with them, even if they're not the easiest to work with, it's like, this is my team. Like, these are my people, because otherwise, if you don't think that way, like, the ship's going down and you can't afford to do that. This is, a serious operation. So there's something there that isn't always felt, I think, in less strenuous and less high stakes situations. People are able to, again, revert back to thinking about themselves. Do I like this product team? Maybe I'll switch teams. Do I want to keep working on this? Like, it's a little bit, there are really good high functioning product teams, and I've worked on those as well, where you feel that camaraderie. But when the stakes are that high, and when there's just, that much pressure, and you are so committed to making your executive do the best that they can do, there's just a certain deep camaraderie there when things go well. And it's really, really hard when something, doesn't go well. So I miss the people, I miss the energy. I miss some of that fast-paced exposure. But those are also some of the things that make it incredibly exhausting, and not something that you can do long-term unless you're a very well-paid, very senior executive, I guess. But